Albert Einstein, the man who bent the universe. Slaughtered, the silent beginning. Phosphate. The room is quiet on this April evening in Princeton, New Jersey. Beyond the window at 112 Mercer Street, cherry blossoms drift across the lawn, carrying with them the soft whisper of spring. Inside, papers cover every surface. Blackboards lean against walls covered in equations that few on earth can comprehend, and a violin rests in its case, waiting for fingers that will never play it again. This is where genius lived for 22 years, where one of history's greatest minds spent his final decades contemplating the mysteries of the cosmos, and where, in just days, that extraordinary journey will come to an end. Safeguard ending is also a beginning, and to understand the magnitude of what will soon be lost, we must travel back 76 years to another March day in another country, to the small city of Ulm in southwestern Germany, where on March 14, 1879, a child was born who would one day teach humanity to see the universe differently. His mother, Pauline Einstein, worried as she held her newborn son. His head seemed unusually large, misshapen even, and his grandmother exclaimed in alarm at the sight of him. They named him Albert, after nobody in particular, a name that seemed ordinary enough for what appeared to be an ordinary child, perhaps even a troubled one. The family soon moved to Munich, where Hermann Einstein, Albert's father, hoped to make his fortune in the electrical engineering business alongside his brother Jakob. It was the age of electricity, the dawn of a new technological era, and Hermann saw opportunity in the humming wires and glowing lights that were beginning to transform German cities. But while his father chased the future through copper and current, young Albert seemed trapped in silence. He did not speak at age 2, as most children do. He did not speak at 3. His parents consulted doctors, their concern mounting with each passing month. When he finally began forming words, he developed a strange habit of repeating sentences softly to himself before speaking them aloud, as if testing the sound of language before releasing it into the world. His worried family gave him a nickname, Der Depperte, the dopey one, never imagining that this slow-speaking child would one day gift humanity with ideas expressed in the most elegant mathematics ever conceived. Colonization. But there were signs, subtle glimmers that something extraordinary stirred behind those quiet eyes. At age 5, his father showed him a simple pocket compass, a gift meant to amuse a sick child confined to bed. Albert stared at the device with an intensity that startled Hermann. The needle always pointed north, no matter how he turned the case, no matter how he shook it. Something invisible, something he could not see or touch, was acting on that needle, guiding it with absolute certainty. Years later, Einstein would recall this moment as one of the deep wonders of his childhood, the first time he sensed that reality contained hidden forces, invisible architectures that shaped the world in ways human eyes could not directly perceive. That compass became his gateway, his first glimpse into a universe governed by invisible laws, waiting to be discovered. Turbulence, however, was not his gateway to anything but frustration and rebellion. At age 6, his parents enrolled him at the Petersschule, a Catholic elementary school in Munich, where he was the only Jewish student. Though he performed well academically, young Albert felt alienated, uncomfortable with the rigid discipline and the military-style obedience demanded by his teachers. He preferred building elaborate structures with playing cards at home, towers that required patience and precision, or reading books about mathematics that his family provided. His mother, Pauline, recognizing her son's sensitivity and his need for beauty, introduced him to the violin when he was 6. At first, Albert resisted the regimented practice, the mechanical drills of scales and exercises. But then he heard Mozart, and something shifted. The mathematical elegance of Mozart's compositions, the way notes flowed with both freedom and structure, captivated him completely. The violin became his companion for life, a tool for thinking, a way to work through problems that seemed unsolvable. In the years ahead, family and colleagues would often hear him playing at odd hours, lost in melody. And then suddenly, he would stop mid-phrase and shout with joy as the solution to some physics problem burst into his consciousness. At age 10, he entered the Luitpold Gymnasium, a prestigious institution that emphasized classics, Latin, and Greek over mathematics and science. Here, the tension between Einstein's mind and the Prussian educational system reached its breaking point. He loathed the authoritarian atmosphere, the demand for absolute obedience, the teaching style that valued memorization over understanding. One teacher told him directly that he would never amount to anything, a pronouncement that must have stung, even as it fueled his determination to prove them wrong. But Albert had discovered something that the gymnasium could not provide, a refuge in the world of ideas. Max Talmud, a young medical student who regularly dined with the Einstein family, brought Albert books on mathematics and science, feeding the boy's voracious intellectual appetite. By age 12, Albert taught himself Euclidean geometry from a book he would later call his sacred little geometry book. And by 14, he had mastered differential and integral calculus on his own, far beyond what his school curriculum required or expected. At 12, something else happened that would shape his intellectual journey. He became deeply religious, composing songs in praise of God and singing them on his way to school. But then he began reading science books, works that contradicted the religious teachings he had accepted, and his faith crumbled, replaced by a profound skepticism of authority that would define his life. If the established order could be wrong about something as fundamental as the nature of existence, then all authority must be questioned. All received wisdom must be tested against observation and reason. This realization, this willingness to challenge the foundations of belief, became the cornerstone of his genius. The final break came when he was 15. His family's business failed, and Hermann moved the company to Italy, seeking better opportunities, leaving Albert behind in Munich to finish his gymnasium education and complete his military service. But Albert could not bear it. He convinced a doctor to certify that he was suffering from neurasthenic exhaustion, giving him a medical excuse to leave school. He also renounced his German citizenship, making himself stateless to avoid military conscription. Then he appeared unexpectedly at his parents' door in Italy, announcing that he would not return to Germany, that he was done with the rigid schools and the militaristic culture that suffocated him. His parents were dismayed, but Albert had made his choice. He would forge his own path, even if it meant uncertainty. And so the compass that once amazed a sick child had led him to this moment, standing at the threshold of young adulthood, a rebel without a country, a brilliant mind without credentials, a boy who spoke late, but who would one day speak truths that would echo through the centuries. The stage was set for a transformation that would reshape human understanding of reality itself. The rebel scholar. Switzerland became his sanctuary, the place where rules bent enough to let a misfit thrive. After some self-study, Einstein took the entrance examination for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich, one of Europe's leading technical institutions. He excelled in mathematics and physics, but failed in French, chemistry, and biology, subjects for which he had little patience or interest. The school recognized his exceptional mathematical ability and offered him conditional admission if he would first complete his secondary education. He enrolled at a special school in Aarau, a small Swiss town, where he found something he had never experienced before. Teachers who encouraged independent thinking, who treated students as individuals rather than soldiers to be drilled. There, lodging with the family of Jost Winteler, Einstein flourished. He fell in love with Winteler's daughter Marie, his first romance, and for the first time in his life, he felt he belonged somewhere. In 1896, he graduated with strong marks and entered the Polytechnic in Zurich to study physics and mathematics, determined to become a teacher who could inspire the kind of curiosity that burned within him. At the Polytechnic, Einstein met the only woman in the physics and mathematics section, Mileva Maric, a Serbian student with a sharp intellect and a shared passion for physics. She was brilliant, intense, and like Albert, she felt like an outsider. They were drawn to each other immediately, not just romantically, but intellectually. They studied together, argued about physics together, read the latest papers together, dreaming of lives dedicated to unraveling nature's secrets. Albert wrote to her about his ideas, about his love, about the work they would do together. She responded with equal passion, calling him her Johnny, while he called her his Dolly. Their professors noticed their closeness, but also noticed something else. Einstein often skipped lectures, preferring to study on his own or simply to think, habits that annoyed his instructors. When he did attend, he sometimes challenged the professors, questioning their explanations with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He was learning physics, but he was also learning to trust his own mind above all else, to follow his instincts even when they diverged from conventional wisdom. When graduation came in 1900, Einstein received his diploma, but his rebellious attitude had consequences. His professors, particularly Heinrich Weber, did not think highly enough of him to recommend him for an academic position, the usual path for promising students. Einstein applied for assistantships at universities across Europe, but the rejections piled up. Meanwhile, Mileva failed her final examinations, unable to match the scores needed to graduate. She was devastated. She was also pregnant with Einstein's child, a situation that scandalized both their families. In early 1902, she returned to Serbia and gave birth to a daughter they named Liesel. But what happened to this child remains one of history's mysteries. She either died in infancy of scarlet fever or was given up for adoption. Mileva never spoke of her publicly, and Einstein never met his daughter. The pain of this loss, or this surrender, cast a shadow over their relationship that would never fully lift. Unable to find an academic post, Einstein finally secured employment through the help of a friend's father. In 1902, he began work at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern as a technical examiner, evaluating patent applications for electromagnetic devices and other inventions. It was a steady job, unexciting but secure, and it required only enough mental effort that Einstein could perform it competently while reserving his deepest thinking for his own pursuits. The patent office became his true university, a place where he learned to analyze complex mechanical problems quickly, to distinguish essential ideas from unnecessary complications, skills that would prove invaluable in his physics work. More importantly, it gave him time. While his university peers pursued traditional academic careers, Einstein spent his spare hours thinking about the problems that obsessed him. Questions about light, about motion, about the fundamental structure of space and time. In 1903, he and Mileva married in a small civil ceremony in Bern. She gave up her dreams of becoming a physicist and settled into the role of housewife. In 1904, their son Hans Albert was born, a healthy, bright child who would one day become an engineer. For a time, there was harmony in their small apartment, with Mileva managing the household and helping Albert with calculations late into the night while their baby slept. Friends who visited them during this period spoke of seeing them work together at their table under lamplight, calculating, discussing, arguing about physics. Whatever Mileva's exact contributions to Einstein's groundbreaking work, there is no doubt they formed an intellectual partnership in those early years, that she was one of the few people who could understand what he was trying to achieve. But Einstein's mind was moving somewhere beyond where anyone else could follow. He had become obsessed with a fundamental problem in physics, a crack in the supposedly complete edifice of 19th century science. Maxwell's equations describing electromagnetism seemed to contradict Newton's laws of motion. How light behaved depended on who was observing it, yet the laws of physics were supposed to be universal. Physicists had proposed increasingly elaborate theories to explain this contradiction, postulating an invisible medium called the luminiferous ether, through which light waves supposedly traveled. But Einstein, with his instinct for cutting through unnecessary complications, suspected something more radical was required. What if the problem was not with the theories of light or motion, but with the very concepts of space and time themselves? What if Newton's absolute time and absolute space were illusions, and reality was far stranger than anyone had imagined? In 1905, everything changed. That year, while still working full-time at the patent office and caring for his infant son, Einstein published 4 papers in the Annalen der Physik, the leading physics journal of the day. Each of these papers was revolutionary. Each could have made his reputation. Together, they detonated like bombs beneath the foundations of classical physics. They were the work of a 26-year-old nobody with no academic position, no laboratory, no prestigious institutional affiliation. Just a patent clerk with a mind that refused to accept the limits of conventional wisdom. The miracle year, 1905. The world calls it his annus mirabilis, his miracle year, but for Einstein, it was simply the year when all the thinking, all the questioning, all the pieces he had been assembling in his mind for years finally came together with a clarity that demanded to be written down and shared. He did not know he was about to become famous. He did not know his name would become synonymous with genius. He only knew that he had glimpsed something true about nature, something that others had missed, and that he needed to explain it with such precision that it could not be misunderstood. The first paper arrived at the journal in March, titled "On a Heuristic Point of View Concerning the Production and Transformation of Light." The problem it addressed was the photoelectric effect, a phenomenon that had puzzled physicists for years. When light struck certain metals, it ejected electrons from their surface. Classical theory predicted that if you increased the intensity of the light, the ejected electrons should gain more energy. But experiments showed something different. Increasing intensity produced more electrons, but did not increase their individual energy. Only increasing the frequency of the light, its color, increased the energy of each electron. It made no sense according to the wave theory of light that had dominated physics for a century. Einstein proposed something radical. Building on Max Planck's earlier work on blackbody radiation, which Planck himself considered merely a mathematical trick, Einstein suggested that light itself was not a continuous wave, but came in discrete packets of energy, quanta, that he would later call photons. Each quantum carried energy proportional to its frequency, expressed in the simple formula E equals h times f, where h was Planck's constant and f was the frequency. When a photon struck an electron, it either had enough energy to knock it free, or it did not. More photons meant more electrons, but each photon acted individually. The electron did not accumulate energy over time from a continuous wave. It received a single quantum jolt. Safeguard. This was heresy. Light as particles? Hadn't Thomas Young's double-slit experiment proven conclusively that light was a wave? Hadn't Maxwell's equations, the crown jewel of 19th-century physics, described electromagnetic radiation as waves propagating through space? But Einstein was undeterred. He saw something others had missed, that nature could be both wave and particle, depending on how you observed it. That the old either-or categories were inadequate to capture the quantum strangeness of reality at its smallest scales. This paper, more than any other work Einstein did, would eventually earn him the Nobel Prize in 1921, though even then, the Nobel Committee would carefully avoid mentioning relativity, the theory for which he was far more famous, but which still made many physicists uncomfortable. Crimson paper appeared in May, addressing an entirely different problem. In 1827, a botanist named Robert Brown had observed that tiny pollen grains suspended in water jittered and danced in random motion, buffeted by invisible forces. The phenomenon, called Brownian motion, had no satisfactory explanation. Einstein provided one. If atoms were real, and if water consisted of these atoms in constant thermal motion, then the pollen grains would be bombarded from all sides by countless molecular collisions, each impact too small to detect individually, but collectively producing the visible, erratic movement. Einstein developed mathematical equations describing this motion, equations that made precise predictions about how far particles would move over time based on their size and the temperature of the fluid. When experiments confirmed his predictions with remarkable accuracy, it became one of the most convincing proofs that atoms actually existed, settling a debate that had raged for decades. Philosophers and chemists who doubted atomic theory could no longer dismiss it as mere hypothesis. Einstein had shown that the invisible world of atoms left observable fingerprints in the macroscopic world we could see and measure. But it was the third paper, submitted in June and published in September, that would transform Einstein from a clever physicist into a revolutionary who rewrote the rules of reality itself. The title was modest, On the Electrodynamics of Moving Bodies, but the content was anything but modest. This was special relativity, and it shattered the comfortable Newtonian universe that humanity had inhabited for more than 2 centuries. The problem Einstein addressed was simple to state, but profound in its implications. The laws of physics should be the same for all observers who are not accelerating, who are in what physicists call inertial reference frames. Galileo had understood this. If you are in a ship moving smoothly across a calm sea, experiments conducted below deck should yield the same results whether the ship is moving or stationary. But Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism seemed to violate this principle. They predicted that light traveled at a specific speed, about 300,000 kilometers per second, but they did not specify relative to what. Physicists assumed there must be a preferred frame of reference, a cosmic rest frame provided by the hypothetical luminiferous ether through which light waves propagated. The famous Michelson-Morley experiment in 1887 had tried to detect Earth's motion through this ether by measuring tiny differences in the speed of light in different directions, but the experiment found nothing. No matter which direction they looked, no matter how Earth moved, light always traveled at the same speed. Einstein took this null result seriously, and he drew a conclusion that seemed impossible. What if the speed of light was the same for all observers, regardless of their motion? What if light did not need a medium to travel through, and there was no ether at all? If this were true, then something else had to give, and Einstein realized with breathtaking clarity what it was. Space and time themselves had to be flexible, relative to the observer. Time could not be a universal, absolute measure ticking at the same rate everywhere. Space could not be a fixed stage on which events unfolded. Instead, space and time were woven together into a single space-time fabric, and how you measured distances and durations depended on how you were moving. The consequences were staggering. If you and I are moving relative to each other, we will disagree about the duration of events, a phenomenon called time dilation. Your clock will appear to me to be running slower than mine, and my clock will appear to you to be running slower than yours. Both observations are equally valid. Neither perspective is privileged. Similarly, we will disagree about the length of objects moving past us, a phenomenon called length contraction. A meter stick moving at high speed appears shorter in the direction of motion to a stationary observer. And perhaps most famous, there is no absolute simultaneity. Events that I observe as happening at the same time, you may observe as happening at different times if you are moving relative to me. Reality itself depends on your reference frame. Foreground dates violated common sense so thoroughly that even Einstein's closest colleagues struggled to accept them. Time that flowed at different rates. Space that compressed. How could this be true? But Einstein provided the mathematics, the Lorentz transformations that showed exactly how time and space measurements changed between reference frames. And he showed that Maxwell's equations remained valid in all reference frames if you accepted these transformations. The universe did not care about human intuition. The universe followed mathematical laws, and those laws revealed a reality far stranger than Newton had ever imagined. Stabilized, the fourth paper, a consequence of special relativity, was just 3 pages long, but contained perhaps the most famous equation in all of science. In November 1905, Einstein showed that mass and energy were not separate entities, but were interconvertible, related by the elegant formula E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Since the speed of light is enormous, even a tiny amount of mass contains a colossal amount of energy. A single kilogram of matter, if converted entirely to energy, would release the equivalent of an atomic bomb. This was not merely theoretical curiosity. Einstein had uncovered the secret power source of stars, the mechanism behind radioactivity, and, though he did not know it yet, the terrible potential of nuclear weapons that would one day haunt his conscience. These 4 papers, published in a single year by an unknown patent clerk, represented one of the greatest intellectual achievements in human history. They addressed different problems, used different methods, but they all shared Einstein's characteristic approach. Question the obvious, trust mathematics over intuition, follow the logic wherever it leads, and never assume that the universe must conform to human expectations. Einstein had not just solved problems, he had revealed that the problems were deeper than anyone realized, that the very concepts physicists used to describe reality were inadequate, that the revolution required was conceptual as much as mathematical. But the world was slow to notice. Some physicists recognized the significance immediately. Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, became one of Einstein's earliest and most important supporters. Hermann Minkowski, Einstein's former mathematics professor at the Polytechnic, who had once called him a lazy dog, read the relativity paper and developed the 4-dimensional space-time formulation that made Einstein's theory mathematically elegant and clear. But many others dismissed the ideas as too abstract, too counterintuitive, or simply wrong. Einstein remained at the patent office, doing his job, raising his son, and continuing to think. Recognition would come, but slowly, fitfully, as experimental evidence accumulated and as more physicists worked through the mathematics and realized that this patent clerk had, against all odds, glimpsed the truth. Fame was coming for Albert Einstein, but so was something else. The ideas that brought him acclaim would also bring him enemies. The changing world would force him into impossible choices, and the theories he created with pure intellectual curiosity would enable technologies he never intended and could never have imagined. The miracle year was over, but the consequences of those 4 papers would echo through the rest of his life and far beyond, shaping the course of science, technology, warfare, and human civilization itself. Love, loss, and genius. Intellectuals. As Einstein's reputation in the physics community began to grow, his personal life crumbled in ways that revealed the profound costs of his singular focus. Success came quickly after 1905, though not immediately. By 1909, Einstein had finally secured his first academic position as an associate professor at the University of Zurich, leaving the patent office behind. 2 years later, he accepted a full professorship at the German University in Prague. In 1910, Mileva gave birth to their second son, Eduard, called Tet by the family. But the joy of this addition could not mask the deepening cracks in their marriage. Mileva had become increasingly depressed and jealous as Einstein's career accelerated, while her own dreams of physics faded entirely into domestic duties. She managed the household, cared for the children, and still helped Einstein with calculations, but the partnership they had once shared as students had transformed into something more traditional and less equal, a transformation that neither of them was happy with, but neither could change. Einstein wrote to friends that Mileva was becoming difficult, jealous of the women he spoke with at academic gatherings, resentful of his success. She wrote to her best friend Helene that Albert lived only for his work, that the family had become unimportant to him, background noise in the symphony of physics that occupied his mind. The truth was probably painful for both of them. Einstein had discovered that he needed solitude to do his work, that emotional entanglements and domestic obligations, while necessary, drained the mental energy he needed for the intense concentration his physics required. He was not a cruel man, but he was an absent one, physically present but mentally somewhere else, working through equations and thought experiments, even as his sons played at his feet. Mileva needed emotional connection, support, acknowledgement that her sacrifices mattered. She needed to feel valued for more than her ability to compute results and manage a household. They had wanted different things and built a life that satisfied neither. In 1912, Einstein accepted a position back at his alma mater in Zurich, and Mileva was briefly happy to return to the city where they had met and fallen in love. But by 1913, Einstein received an offer he could not refuse. The prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Physics in Berlin wanted him as director, and the University of Berlin offered him a professorship with no teaching duties, complete freedom to research whatever he wished. For a physicist, it was paradise. For his family, it was disaster. Mileva did not want to move to Berlin. Einstein's cousin Elsa Lowenthal lived there, and Mileva's jealousy was not unfounded. Einstein had been corresponding secretly with Elsa, whom he had known since childhood, and their letters grew increasingly intimate. In July 1914, the family moved to Berlin. Within weeks, it was clear the marriage was over. Einstein was seeing Elsa regularly, spending more time with her than with his wife. He had, in effect, already moved on emotionally. But what came next revealed a coldness that is difficult to reconcile with the warm, grandfatherly image Einstein would later cultivate. He presented Mileva with a list of conditions, a set of demands that she would have to accept if they were to continue living under the same roof. He would provide her 3 meals a day. He would keep his study and bedroom clean, but she was to expect no affection from him, no intimacy, no companionship. They would not appear together in public. She would not ask for any personal relationship and would leave his room or study immediately when requested. It was a contract for a maid and cook, not a wife, and it was humiliating beyond measure. Mileva tried to accept it, tried to endure for the sake of their sons, but she could not. After only a few months, she took Hans Albert and Eduard and returned to Zurich, where she would spend the rest of her life struggling financially and emotionally, raising their children essentially alone. Einstein stayed in Berlin, closer to Elsa, and as World War I erupted around him, he threw himself into the greatest intellectual challenge of his career, the extension of relativity to include gravity, the theory that would become general relativity. The divorce was not finalized until 1919, and the terms were unusual. Einstein, confident that he would eventually win the Nobel Prize, promised Mileva the prize money in lieu of alimony. It was an extraordinary gamble. The prize could take years to materialize, if it came at all, but Einstein knew his work's value even if the Nobel Committee did not yet, and he wanted to provide for his sons in a way that did not require continued, direct financial entanglement with Mileva. When he did win the prize in 1921, he kept his promise, transferring the money to a Swiss bank account, where Mileva could access the interest, though she needed his consent to touch the capital. She used the money to purchase apartment buildings in Zurich, hoping to live off rental income, but managing properties required skills she did not have, and the investments became another burden. Meanwhile, their younger son, Eduard, developed into a sensitive, brilliant young man with interests in literature and medicine, but also with mental instability that revealed itself in his late teens. He suffered a mental breakdown in his early 20s and was diagnosed with schizophrenia, the same condition that would later be found to run in Einstein's family through his mother's line. Eduard spent much of his adult life in and out of psychiatric institutions, a reality that devastated Mileva and that Einstein struggled to confront. He visited Eduard occasionally, but he found it painful to see his son in such condition, and over time the visits became less frequent. Hans Albert would later say that his father's only failure was as a father, that Einstein had essentially given up on the family to pursue his work. The critique stung because it carried truth. Einstein loved his sons in his way, but his way was distant, intellectual, expressed through letters and financial support rather than presence and emotional engagement. And Mileva, the brilliant young woman who had once dreamed of discovering the secrets of the universe alongside Einstein, spent her final decades in poverty and isolation, caring for her sick son, teaching physics to schoolchildren to make ends meet, and carrying the weight of sacrifices that history has only recently begun to acknowledge. Some have argued that her contributions to Einstein's early work, particularly the 1905 papers, were substantial, that she did much of the mathematics, that the ideas were developed in collaboration. Einstein's early letters to her, with phrases like "our work" and "our theory," suggest a partnership. But the extent of her contributions remains debated, impossible to quantify with certainty, and Einstein never publicly credited her. Whether this was because her role was minor, or because he took it for granted, or because acknowledging a woman's contribution would have diminished his chances for recognition in a deeply sexist scientific community, we cannot know for certain. What is certain is that Mileva's story is a tragedy, a tale of promise unfulfilled, of genius subordinated to domesticity and mental illness, of a woman who loved a man who could not, or would not, love her back in the way she needed. Einstein married Elsa in June 1919, just months after his divorce from Mileva was finalized. Elsa was his opposite in many ways, not an intellectual partner, but a caretaker who managed his household, protected his time, and took pride in his fame. She died in 1936 after years of illness, and Einstein mourned her, but never remarried. He had learned, perhaps, that his work came first, that his need for solitude was non-negotiable, and that he was not built for the kind of marriage that others took for granted. His personal life was littered with failures, with people hurt by his emotional unavailability, with relationships that began with promise and ended in bitterness or sorrow. The man who could understand the universe at its deepest levels struggled to understand the human hearts closest to him, including his own. The greatest idea, general relativity. While his marriage disintegrated and Europe descended into the madness of World War I, Einstein embarked on the most difficult intellectual journey of his life. Special relativity, as revolutionary as it was, applied only to observers moving at constant speeds, to reference frames that were not accelerating. But the real universe was full of acceleration. Planets orbited stars, objects fell to Earth, spacecraft changed direction. And crucially, special relativity could not incorporate gravity, Newton's force that shaped the cosmos. Einstein knew that his theory was incomplete, and he knew that finding the correct extension would require rethinking gravity as radically as he had rethought space and time. The breakthrough came to him in 1907, with what he would later call the happiest thought of his life. He imagined a man falling from the roof of a building. During the fall, the man would feel weightless. He would not feel the pull of gravity. Objects released from his hand would fall beside him at the same rate, appearing to float. From the falling man's perspective, he was in a gravity-free environment, indistinguishable from the weightlessness of deep space. This simple thought experiment revealed a profound truth. Gravity and acceleration were equivalent, two sides of the same coin. A person standing on Earth feels weight, not because gravity is pulling them down, but because the ground is accelerating them upward, as Earth's surface resists their free fall through curved spacetime. Conversely, an astronaut accelerating in a rocket at 9.8 meters per second squared would feel exactly the same force pressing them into their seat as a person feels standing on Earth's surface. This equivalence principle became the foundation for Einstein's new theory. But turning it into a complete mathematical framework took him nearly 8 years of frustrating work. The problem was that Einstein's training in mathematics, while strong, had not prepared him for the level of mathematical sophistication his new theory required. He needed to describe space-time as a curved, four-dimensional surface where matter and energy determined the curvature, and that curvature in turn determined how matter and energy moved. The mathematics for this already existed, developed decades earlier by mathematicians like Bernhard Riemann and Gregorio Ricci Curbastro for purely abstract reasons, with no thought of physics applications. But Einstein did not know this mathematics, and even when his friend Marcel Grossmann, a talented mathematician, showed him the relevant tools, Einstein struggled to use them correctly. He made false starts. He published papers proposing field equations that he later realized were wrong. He abandoned approaches that were actually correct because he misunderstood some mathematical property. He worked obsessively, often neglecting his teaching duties and even his health. Colleagues noticed that he looked haggard, that he had lost weight, that physics was consuming him. Mileva's departure with their sons in 1914, while emotionally painful, also removed a source of distraction and guilt, freeing him to focus entirely on the equations that danced just beyond his grasp. And gradually, through relentless effort and occasional flashes of insight, the correct theory emerged. In November 1915, Einstein presented a series of 4 papers to the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin, each building on the previous, each correcting earlier errors, until on November 25th, he arrived at the final, correct field equations for general relativity. These equations are deceptively compact when written in modern tensor notation, a simple line that expresses how the curvature of space-time relates to the distribution of mass and energy within it. But that simplicity conceals immense complexity. The equations are nonlinear, meaning solutions interact with themselves in intricate ways. Solving them for realistic situations requires formidable mathematical skill and often sophisticated approximations or computer simulations. Yet from these equations flowed predictions of stunning clarity and boldness. Einstein quickly calculated that his theory predicted exactly the observed anomaly in Mercury's orbit that had puzzled astronomers for decades. Mercury's elliptical orbit around the Sun slowly rotates over time, a phenomenon called precession of the perihelion. And Newton's theory predicted most of this precession based on the gravitational tugs from other planets. But there was a tiny residual precession, 43 arc-seconds per century, that Newton's theory could not explain. Einstein's equations predicted this discrepancy perfectly, with no adjustable parameters, no fudge factors. When he finished the calculation, he later told friends, he experienced heart palpitations and felt as if something inside him had snapped. He knew he had found the truth. But Mercury's orbit was just the beginning. General relativity made other predictions that could be tested. Light passing near a massive object like the Sun should be deflected by the curvature of space-time, bending by a specific amount that was twice what Newton's theory would predict if light were considered as particles with mass. And light climbing out of a gravitational well should lose energy, becoming red-shifted, its wavelength stretched toward the red end of the spectrum. Einstein published these predictions in a paper in 1916, knowing that verification would have to wait until technology and circumstances allowed for precise measurements. Psychologists came in 1919. World War I had ended, and astronomers were able to plan expeditions to observe a total solar eclipse, when stars near the sun's edge would become visible, and their positions could be measured to see if sunlight bent starlight, as Einstein predicted. 2 British expeditions set out, one to the island of Principe off the coast of West Africa, the other to Sobral, Brazil. The leader of the Principe expedition was Arthur Eddington, a brilliant astrophysicist and a Quaker pacifist who saw in general relativity a theory of such beauty that it transcended national boundaries and the hatreds of war. Eddington was an early champion of Einstein's work, and he was determined to test it rigorously. The results, announced at a joint meeting of the Royal Society and the Royal Astronomical Society in London on November 6, 1919, confirmed Einstein's predictions within the margin of experimental error. Light was bent by the sun's gravity. Space was curved. Newton's universe of absolute space and time was dethroned. The Times of London declared, "Revolution in science," and the New York Times announced, "Einstein theory triumphs." Overnight, Einstein became a global celebrity, the most famous scientist in the world, his name synonymous with genius and with ideas so profound that even educated people admitted they could not fully understand them. Reporters camped outside his apartment. Letters poured in from admirers and cranks. He was invited to give lectures around the world. His distinctive appearance, the wild hair, the rumpled clothes, the twinkling eyes, became instantly recognizable. But with fame came scrutiny and criticism. Some attacks were scientific, from physicists who doubted the theory or who believed the eclipse measurements were inconclusive. Other attacks were political and personal. In Germany, where Einstein had spent the war as a vocal pacifist who publicly opposed German militarism, nationalists and anti-Semites saw him as a traitor. When he gave a lecture in Berlin in 1920, opponents disrupted it, heckling and shouting. A group of German physicists, including some with Nobel Prizes, organized conferences denouncing relativity as Jewish physics, a fabrication designed to undermine true German science. Philipp Lenard and Johannes Stark, both Nobel laureates who would later enthusiastically support the Nazi regime, led these attacks with venom, claiming that Einstein's theories were not just wrong, but part of an international Jewish conspiracy to corrupt physics. Einstein largely ignored these attacks, recognizing them as anti-Semitic garbage dressed up in scientific language. But they hurt nonetheless, and they revealed the dangers that were gathering on the horizon. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile democracy, was beset by economic chaos and political extremism. Anti-Semitism, which Einstein had hoped was receding into history's past, was instead intensifying, fueled by economic desperation and nationalist resentment over Germany's defeat in the war. Einstein received death threats. Friends warned him to be cautious, to avoid public places, to consider leaving Germany if conditions worsened. He resisted at first, believing that reason and civilization would prevail. He was wrong. But in those years before the darkness fully descended, Einstein reached the peak of his scientific powers. General relativity was his masterpiece, a theory of gravity that was also a theory of space-time, of cosmology, of the universe itself. It predicted phenomena that would not be confirmed for decades. Gravitational waves, ripples in space-time produced by accelerating masses, which Einstein predicted in 1916, but which would not be directly detected until 2015. Black holes, regions where space-time curvature becomes so extreme that not even light can escape, predicted by Karl Schwarzschild's exact solution to Einstein's equations just months after Einstein published them, though the full implications were not understood until much later. And cosmological solutions describing an expanding universe, a possibility Einstein initially resisted by adding a cosmological constant to his equations to keep the universe static, a modification he later called the biggest blunder of his life, when Edwin Hubble's observations showed that the universe was indeed expanding. Stabilize had climbed the mountain. He had seen further than anyone before him, and the view from the summit revealed a universe far grander, stranger, and more beautiful than humanity had dared imagine. But he could not stay on the mountain forever. The world below was changing, and forces were gathering that would force Einstein to make choices he never wanted to make, to become entangled in political struggles that threatened not just his science, but his life and the lives of everyone he loved. The Gathering Darkness, Neb. The 1920s were years of contradictions for Einstein, On one hand, he enjoyed unprecedented scientific prestige, traveling the world to give lectures, meeting with fellow physicists, politicians, and intellectuals, using his fame to advocate for causes he believed in, particularly pacifism and international cooperation. He supported the League of Nations, despite its weaknesses, as humanity's best hope for preventing future wars. He worked tirelessly to help Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe and to support the establishment of Hebrew University in Jerusalem, a project that combined his ethnic identification with Judaism with his commitment to education and scholarship. He was not a religious man in any conventional sense, but he felt a deep connection to Jewish culture and history, and he saw the persecution of Jews in Europe as an assault on human dignity that demanded resistance. On the other hand, the political and economic situation in Germany grew increasingly unstable. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s destroyed the savings of millions of Germans. The Treaty of Versailles, which many Germans saw as a humiliation imposed by vindictive victors, fueled resentment and nationalist rage. Political violence became common, with extremist groups from both the left and right battling in the streets. And in this chaos, the Nazis rose to power, exploiting fears and resentments, offering simple explanations for complex problems, and channeling rage towards scapegoats, particularly Jews. In 1921, Einstein traveled to the United States with Chaim Weizmann, a chemist and Zionist leader who would later become the first president of Israel, on a tour to raise funds for Hebrew University. Einstein was mobbed wherever he went, treated like a movie star, his lectures filling auditoriums even though most attendees could not understand the mathematics he described. He found America refreshing, less constrained by class hierarchies than Europe, more optimistic and forward-looking. He also found American racism disturbing, the casual segregation and discrimination against Black Americans a stark contradiction to the country's democratic ideals. But he admired the country's energy and its relative freedom from the ancient hatreds that poisoned Europe. When Einstein returned to Europe, he learned that he had been awarded the 1921 Nobel Prize in Physics. The announcement came in November 1922, delayed because the Nobel Committee had reserved the 1921 prize, unable to decide on a recipient that year, a highly unusual move. The prize citation carefully specified that it was awarded for his services to theoretical physics and especially for his discovery of the law of the photoelectric effect. Relativity was not mentioned. The omission was deliberate. Some members of the Nobel Committee, particularly the influential ophthalmologist Alvar Gullstrand, actively opposed Einstein receiving the prize for relativity, which Gullstrand did not understand and did not believe was correct. Other committee members were uncomfortable with theoretical physics that could not be directly verified in a laboratory. The photoelectric effect was more concrete, more experimental, safer. Einstein understood the snub, but did not make a public issue of it. When invited to Sweden to deliver his Nobel lecture, he was given the traditional latitude to speak on any topic. To the committee's chagrin, he chose to lecture not on the photoelectric effect, but on relativity, delivering a talk titled Fundamental Ideas and Problems of the Theory of Relativity. It was a quiet act of defiance, a way of reminding the Nobel Committee and the world that his greatest work was not what they had honored, but what they had pointedly ignored. Still, Einstein kept his promise to Mileva, transferring the prize money to her in Zurich. The amount was substantial, 121,572 Swedish krona, enough to make a real difference if managed carefully. For Mileva, struggling to raise 2 sons alone, it was both a financial relief and a bitter reminder of what might have been if her marriage and her own scientific dreams had not crumbled. As the 1920s gave way to the 1930s, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. The Nazi Party grew in influence, exploiting the economic devastation of the Great Depression to win elections and build a mass movement. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Within weeks, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, burned under mysterious circumstances, an event the Nazis used as a pretext to crush political opposition and consolidate power. In April, Hitler issued the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which stripped Jews and political opponents of their positions in universities and government institutions. Thousands of scientists, scholars, artists, and intellectuals faced immediate dismissal. Jewish businesses were boycotted. Books by Jewish authors, including scientific works, were burned in public bonfires. The universities that had once been the pride of German science and culture became instruments of Nazi ideology. Einstein saw what was coming. He had been on a lecture tour in the United States when Hitler took power, and he made the decision immediately. He would not return to Germany. He resigned from the Prussian Academy of Sciences, renounced his German citizenship for the second time in his life, and accepted a position at the newly founded Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. His possessions in Germany were confiscated. His summer cottage near Berlin was seized and turned into a Hitler youth camp. His sailboat, which he loved and on which he had spent peaceful hours thinking, was sold off. A Nazi pamphlet listed his name with the caption, "Not yet hanged." A bounty of 20,000 marks was offered for information leading to his assassination. His books, including his scientific papers, were burned alongside those of other Jewish intellectuals in the book burnings that swept Germany in May 1933. Einstein and Elsa left Europe for good in October 1933, sailing from England to America. They would never set foot in Germany again. Before leaving, Einstein gave a speech at the Royal Albert Hall in London on the importance of academic freedom, a speech that drew thousands and that explicitly condemned the Nazi regime's assault on science and learning. He knew he was speaking not just for himself, but for the thousands of Jewish scientists, many of them his friends and colleagues, who were being driven from their homes and careers, many of whom would not survive what was coming. The Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton became Einstein's final home, a sanctuary where he could work undisturbed, surrounded by other brilliant minds who had also fled Europe's turmoil. Princeton itself, a quiet university town in New Jersey, was not without its own problems. It was racially segregated. The university did not admit black students. Hotels and restaurants refused service to African Americans. Einstein, who had experienced persecution as a Jew in Europe, recognized the parallels immediately and would spend his years in Princeton actively supporting the civil rights movement, a commitment we will explore in depth. But for now, at the Institute, he had what he needed most: time, freedom, and the intellectual stimulation of colleagues like Kurt Gödel, the brilliant logician who would become one of Einstein's closest friends in his final years. But Europe's darkness followed him across the ocean in the form of letters from scientists still trapped there, refugees desperate for help, and eventually in the form of the most consequential letter Einstein would ever sign. The letter that changed the world. Amber, 1939. Europe stood on the brink of another catastrophic war. Hitler had annexed Austria, seized Czechoslovakia, and was now threatening Poland. Britain and France, having failed to stop Nazi expansion through appeasement, finally drew a line, promising to defend Poland if Hitler attacked. Few believed the promise would prevent war. The question was not if, but when the storm would break. Into this tense atmosphere came three Hungarian Jewish physicists who had fled Europe and found refuge in America: Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, and Edward Teller. They brought with them knowledge and fear in equal measure. The knowledge was that German physicists had discovered nuclear fission, the splitting of uranium atoms that released enormous energy. The fear was that Nazi Germany, with its formidable scientific establishment and its ruthless leadership, might harness this discovery to create a weapon of unprecedented destructive power, an atomic bomb. Minimized Szilard was the most concerned. He had conceived the idea of a nuclear chain reaction years earlier while waiting at a traffic light in London, imagining how one neutron could split an atom, releasing more neutrons that would split more atoms in an exponential cascade. When fission was discovered in late 1938, he immediately recognized its potential, both as an energy source and as a weapon. He also recognized that Germany had a head start. German scientists had discovered fission. Germany controlled Czechoslovakia's uranium mines, and Germany had physicists like Werner Heisenberg who understood nuclear physics as well as anyone in the world. Szilard and Wigner believed that the United States government needed to be warned, that America needed to start its own research program immediately, both to develop atomic energy and to prevent Germany from gaining a monopolic advantage. But they faced a problem. They were refugees, foreigners with accents unknown to American officials, lacking the credibility to get their warnings taken seriously. They needed someone with stature, someone whose name would open doors and command attention. They needed Albert Einstein. On a hot July afternoon in 1939, Szilard and Wigner drove to Long Island, where Einstein was spending the summer renting a cottage in the village of Peconic. They had difficulty finding the house. Nobody seemed to know where Dr. Moore, Einstein's host, lived. Finally, Szilard spotted a young boy on the street and asked if he knew where Professor Einstein lived. The boy did, and he led them to a modest cottage near the water, where they found Einstein in casual clothes, lost in thought, enjoying the peace of summer. Sitting on the porch, Szilard explained the situation. He described nuclear fission, the chain reaction, the potential for a bomb of enormous power. Einstein, a pacifist who had spent his life advocating against war, listened with growing alarm. He had not been following the latest developments in nuclear physics closely. His own work had moved in other directions, and he had not immediately grasped the implications of fission when it was first reported. But Szilard's explanation brought it into sharp focus. The possibility was real. The danger was urgent. Einstein agreed that President Roosevelt needed to be informed. Together, they drafted a letter, carefully worded to be clear without being alarmist, technical enough to convey the science, but accessible enough for a non-scientist to understand. The letter, dated August 2, 1939, explained that recent work suggested that uranium could be made into a new and important source of energy, that extremely powerful bombs could be constructed, and that Germany had stopped the sale of uranium from Czechoslovakian mines, suggesting that German scientists recognized the significance. Einstein urged Roosevelt to establish contact with physicists working on nuclear research, to secure a supply of uranium ore, and to speed up experimental work on chain reactions. Einstein signed the letter. It was typed on his personal stationery. Only his signature was needed. No one else signed it. No one else had to. The letter bore the name that everyone recognized, the name that guaranteed it would reach the president's desk and be taken seriously. Undermined with Einstein's signature, bureaucracy moved slowly. The letter sat for weeks before it was delivered to Roosevelt by Alexander Sachs, a banker and economist who had access to the president. When Sachs finally got his appointment in October, he did not simply hand Roosevelt the letter. He understood that a busy president might glance at it and set it aside. Instead, Sachs read it aloud, explained its significance, and emphasized that Nazi Germany might already be working on such a weapon. Roosevelt understood immediately. "What you are after is to see that the Nazis don't blow us up," he said, then called in his aide with instructions to form a committee to explore the matter. The committee moved slowly at first. Nuclear physics was still largely theoretical. The engineering challenges were enormous. Many scientists doubted that a bomb could actually be built, or if it could, whether it would be worth the astronomical cost. But as the war in Europe intensified, as country after country fell to Nazi conquest, as reports filtered back suggesting that Germany was indeed pursuing nuclear research, the urgency grew. By 1942, the effort had expanded into the Manhattan Project, a massive secret program that would eventually employ hundreds of thousands of people and cost billions of dollars, all dedicated to building the atomic bomb before Germany did. Einstein himself played no direct role in the Manhattan Project beyond that initial letter. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, wrote to military officials describing Einstein as a security risk due to his pacifist views and his past associations with left-wing organizations. Einstein was denied the security clearance necessary to work on the bomb. He was consulted briefly on one minor technical question related to isotope separation, and he provided a brief written report, but that was the extent of his involvement. The scientists working on the bomb in Los Alamos knew Einstein's theories formed the foundation for their work, that E equals mc squared was the formula that explained why the bomb would be so powerful. But Einstein himself remained in Princeton, continuing his own research, teaching occasionally, and largely unaware of the scale and success of the project his letter had helped initiate. Then came August 6, 1945. An American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, exploded with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT, instantly killing tens of thousands of people, with tens of thousands more dying in the following weeks and months from burns, radiation sickness, and injuries. 3 days later, a second bomb, Fat Man, destroyed Nagasaki. The death toll was horrific, conservative estimates placing it around 140,000 in Hiroshima and 74,000 in Nagasaki, though exact numbers remain disputed because so many victims simply vanished in the firestorms. Crimson when Einstein heard the news, he was shattered. Horrible, horrible, he repeated to friends, barely able to speak. He had known the bomb was theoretically possible. He had warned Roosevelt of the danger of German nuclear weapons, but he had not imagined this. The reality of entire cities erased, of civilians, women and children incinerated by fire born from the equation he had written in 1905. He tried to process what had happened, what his role in it had been. Publicly, he said little in the immediate aftermath. Privately, he struggled with profound regret. In a 1947 interview with Newsweek magazine, Einstein was quoted as saying, "Had I known that the Germans would not succeed in producing an atomic bomb, I would never have lifted a finger." In 1954, a year before his death, he wrote to his old friend Linus Pauling, "I made one great mistake in my life when I signed the letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made. But there was some justification, the danger that the Germans would make them. That justification, the fear that Hitler might gain the bomb first, had driven the decision. But with the war over and the full horror of nuclear weapons revealed, the justification felt hollow. Einstein knew that the genie could not be put back in the bottle, that nuclear weapons would define the post-war world, that humanity now possessed the power to destroy itself utterly. For the rest of his life, Einstein became an advocate for nuclear disarmament and world government, arguing that only a global authority with the power to prevent war could stop the nuclear arms race that was already beginning. In 1955, just days before his death, he signed the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, along with Bertrand Russell and other prominent scientists, calling for nuclear disarmament and warning that nuclear war threatened human extinction. "We appeal, as human beings, to human beings," the manifesto declared. "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." Einstein's legacy regarding the atomic bomb is complex and often misunderstood. He did not invent the bomb. He did not work on the Manhattan Project. His theories provided the scientific foundation, but scientists would have developed those theories with or without Einstein, likely within a few years. What Einstein did was use his name, his credibility, to ensure that American leaders took the threat seriously, to push bureaucracy into motion, to help start the process that led to the bomb. And for that, he bore responsibility, a weight he carried with anguish and regret for the rest of his life. He was a pacifist who enabled a weapon. He was a scientist who unlocked power he never intended for destruction. He was a human being confronting the fact that knowledge, once discovered, cannot be undiscovered, and that genius brings no immunity from error, regret, or the terrible unintended consequences of even well-meaning actions. The Advocate. World focused on Einstein's science and his role in the atomic age, few noticed the quiet revolution he waged in his own backyard. Princeton, New Jersey, for all its intellectual prestige, was a deeply segregated town when Einstein arrived in 1933. The university did not admit black students. Hotels and restaurants refused to serve African Americans. The local movie theater had separate seating sections. It was the American South transplanted to the North, a reality that Einstein, having experienced anti-Semitism in Europe, found both familiar and intolerable. Einstein had always opposed injustice, but in America, removed from the immediate dangers of Nazism, he found both the freedom and the opportunity to act on his convictions more directly. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great black intellectual and civil rights activist, wrote to Einstein asking if he would speak publicly about racial equality. Einstein agreed without hesitation. He began writing articles and giving speeches denouncing racism as a disease of white people, a phrase that shocked many white Americans who preferred to frame racial problems as issues with black people rather than as products of white supremacy. Einstein saw through the euphemisms and evasions. He had watched how Germany had constructed elaborate justifications for persecuting Jews. He recognized the same patterns in America's treatment of black citizens, the same pseudo-scientific racism, the same moral corruption. One of Einstein's first personal acts against Princeton's segregation came in 1937, when Marian Anderson, one of the world's greatest opera singers, came to perform at Princeton's McCarter Theatre. Anderson was black, and when she tried to check into Princeton's Nassau Inn, the premier hotel in town, she was refused. The hotel did not serve Negroes. Einstein, hearing of this insult, immediately sent a message to Anderson, inviting her to stay at his home. She accepted, and their friendship lasted for the rest of Einstein's life. Whenever Anderson came to Princeton, she stayed with Einstein and his stepdaughter, Margot. For Einstein, it was a simple matter of hospitality and human decency. For Anderson, and for black Americans who heard the story, it was a powerful statement. A famous white man using his privilege to challenge segregation in a concrete, personal way. In 1946, Einstein did something even more remarkable. He agreed to travel to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania to give a speech and receive an honorary degree. Lincoln was a historically black university, founded in 1854, nicknamed the Black Princeton. Einstein almost never accepted such honors or invitations to speak. He found academic ceremonies tedious and preferred to spend his time on research. But Lincoln University was different. He saw it as an opportunity to make a statement about racial justice, and he accepted. The trip was not easy for a man in his late 60s with health problems. The journey from Princeton to Lincoln took nearly 2 hours by car. But Einstein made the trip gladly, and when he stood before Lincoln's students and faculty, he did not mince words. He spoke about the moral imperative to fight racism, about the connections between oppression of Jews in Europe and oppression of black Americans. He called racism a disease, a sickness that infected American society and needed to be cured through education, law, and moral courage. The speech was front-page news in black newspapers across the country, but most white media outlets barely covered it or ignored it entirely. They preferred their Einstein as a harmless genius, a figure of quirky brilliance, but not one who challenged the social order. Einstein did not care about their discomfort. He joined the Princeton chapter of the NAACP. He testified in court on behalf of black defendants facing racist prosecutions. In 1946, after a particularly brutal incident in Columbia, Tennessee, where white mobs attacked black neighborhoods and hundreds of state troopers with submachine guns destroyed black-owned businesses in a 4-block area, arresting 25 black men on trumped-up murder charges, Einstein joined Eleanor Roosevelt, Langston Hughes, Thurgood Marshall, and others in demanding justice. He donated money, he signed petitions, he used his fame to draw attention to cases that white America wanted to ignore. He also befriended Paul Robeson, the singer, actor, and activist who was blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his communist sympathies and his vocal support for civil rights. When Robeson's passport was revoked, preventing him from traveling or performing abroad, Einstein publicly defended him, calling the passport denial an assault on freedom. This was not a safe position to take. The 1950s were years of paranoia and conformity, when association with suspected communists could destroy careers and reputations. The FBI kept a massive file on Einstein, over 1,800 pages documenting his political activities, his associations with left-wing organizations, his criticism of McCarthyism, and the House Un-American Activities Committee. J. Edgar Hoover saw Einstein as a subversive, a dangerous radical whose fame made him particularly troublesome. But Einstein was too famous to silence completely, and he knew it. He used his platform without apology, speaking out when others stayed silent, risking his reputation because he believed silence in the face of injustice was complicity. Einstein's activism extended beyond racial justice. He worked tirelessly to help refugee scientists flee Europe, using his connections and his fame to secure visas, find academic positions, and provide financial support. He lobbied the American government to ease immigration restrictions, arguing that America had a moral obligation to save those fleeing Nazi persecution. He supported labor unions, spoke out against loyalty oaths required of teachers and professors, and criticized the atomic bomb tests that were poisoning the atmosphere with radioactive fallout. In 1952, after the death of Chaim Weizmann, the first president of Israel, the Israeli government offered the presidency to Einstein. It was an extraordinary gesture, an acknowledgement of his stature and his lifelong support for the Jewish people. But Einstein declined. He was 73 years old, in declining health, and he knew that he was temperamentally unsuited for political leadership. "I am deeply moved by the offer," he wrote, "but I am not the right person for this position." He remained committed to Israel's existence as a refuge for persecuted Jews, but he also criticized Israeli policies toward Palestinian Arabs, arguing that peace required mutual respect and coexistence, not domination. His nuanced position, supporting a Jewish homeland while insisting on justice for Arabs, put him at odds with hardline Zionists who saw any criticism as betrayal. Einstein did not care. He had spent his life following his conscience, not the demands of political movements or ethnic loyalty. What unified all of Einstein's activism was a fundamental belief in human dignity and equality, a belief that had been forged in his own experiences of persecution and that had been deepened by his scientific understanding of the universe. If the laws of physics were the same for all observers, if there was no privileged reference frame in space and time, then surely all humans deserved equal treatment, regardless of race, religion, or nationality. His science and his morality reinforced each other, both products of a mind that questioned authority, rejected arbitrary distinctions, and sought universal principles underlying apparent diversity. The physicist who had revolutionized our understanding of space and time spent his final decades fighting for a world where all people could live with dignity and freedom, where the arbitrary boundaries of race and nation would be transcended, just as he had transcended the arbitrary boundaries of classical physics. It was a battle he knew he would not win in his lifetime, but that did not stop him from fighting. He had glimpsed what the universe could be. Now he fought for what humanity could become. The final question. In his later years at Princeton, Einstein walked every day to his office at the Institute for Advanced Study, usually in the company of Kurt Gödel, the Austrian logician whose incompleteness theorems had shaken the foundations of mathematics as profoundly as relativity had shaken physics. The two men, both refugees from Europe's darkness, both possessed of minds that saw truths others missed, became close friends despite their differences in temperament. Gödel was fragile, paranoid, prone to believing conspiracy theories and to refusing food for fear of poison. Einstein was his anchor, the friend who coaxed him to eat, who walked with him daily, who provided companionship and intellectual stimulation. They talked about everything. Mathematics and physics, of course, but also philosophy, politics, the nature of time. Gödel believed time was an illusion, that the equations of general relativity allowed for time travel, for closed, time-like curves that looped back on themselves. Einstein found this fascinating but troubling, another way in which the universe revealed itself to be stranger than human intuition suggested. They argued about quantum mechanics, the theory that Einstein had helped birth, but that had evolved in directions he could not accept. This rejection of quantum mechanics' implications became Einstein's greatest scientific frustration in his final decades. In the 1920s and 1930s, a new generation of physicists, Niels Bohr, Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, and others, had developed quantum mechanics into a complete theory of atomic and subatomic phenomena. The theory was astonishingly successful, predicting experimental results with unprecedented accuracy. But it was also deeply weird. It described particles not as definite objects with definite positions and velocities, but as probabilistic clouds of possibility that only resolved into definite states when measured. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle declared that certain pairs of properties, like position and momentum, could not both be precisely known simultaneously, not because of experimental limitations, but because of the fundamental nature of reality. And quantum mechanics seemed to require that particles could be entangled, connected in such a way that measuring one instantly affected the other, even across vast distances. Einstein hated it. Not the mathematics, which he understood perfectly, but the interpretation, the claim that reality was fundamentally probabilistic, and that observation created reality rather than merely revealing it. God does not play dice with the universe, he famously declared, expressing his conviction that underneath the probabilistic formalism there must be a deeper deterministic reality, hidden variables that quantum mechanics had not yet discovered. In 1935, working with two younger colleagues, Boris Podolsky and Nathan Rosen, Einstein published a paper describing a thought experiment designed to show that quantum mechanics was incomplete. The EPR paradox, as it became known, demonstrated that if quantum mechanics was correct, then measuring the state of one particle would instantly determine the state of its entangled partner, regardless of the distance between them. This seemed to Einstein to violate the principle of locality, the idea that objects are only influenced by their immediate surroundings. Surely, he argued, this showed that quantum mechanics was missing something. But Niels Bohr and others disagreed. They argued that Einstein's classical intuitions about reality were what needed to be abandoned, that quantum mechanics was telling us something profound about the nature of existence itself. The debate between Einstein and Bohr became one of the great intellectual duels of the 20th century, conducted through papers, letters, and face-to-face discussions that sometimes grew heated. Neither man convinced the other. Decades later, experiments would vindicate quantum mechanics, showing that entanglement was real, that particles could indeed be correlated in the spooky action at a distance that Einstein found so troubling. But those experiments came after Einstein's death. He died convinced that quantum mechanics was not the final word, that a deeper theory awaited discovery. His own search for that deeper theory consumed much of his final decades. He was working on what he called the unified field theory, an attempt to show that gravity and electromagnetism, the two fundamental forces known in his time, were manifestations of a single underlying geometry of space-time. If he could unify these forces mathematically, he believed, it would point the way toward a complete description of nature, a theory that would eliminate the probabilistic weirdness of quantum mechanics and restore a deterministic, causal understanding of the universe. He never succeeded. Year after year, he filled notebooks with equations, trying different mathematical approaches, finding each one inadequate. His assistants would dutifully calculate what the latest version of the theory predicted, only to find contradictions or disagreements with experiment. Einstein would acknowledge the failure and start again. Younger physicists saw his quest as quixotic, a waste of his remaining years. They were exploring quantum field theory, particle physics, nuclear forces, exciting frontiers where progress was rapid and experimental confirmation abundant. Einstein's unified field theory seemed like a relic, the obsession of an old man who could not accept that the universe was different from what he wished it to be. But Einstein could not stop. It was not stubbornness, or not just stubbornness. It was the same impulse that had driven him his entire life, the conviction that nature's deepest truths were elegant, unified, governed by comprehensible principles. He had tasted that elegance in special and general relativity. He could not believe that the universe's ultimate description be a patchwork of disconnected theories, that quantum randomness was the final answer. So he kept working, even as his health declined, even as the physics community moved on without him, even as he became isolated intellectually in a way he had never been before. His isolation was not complete. He still had friends, colleagues who visited, correspondence with scientists around the world. He played his violin, finding solace in Mozart and Bach when equations frustrated him. He sailed on Carnegie Lake when weather permitted, though he never learned to swim and capsized more than once. He received a constant stream of visitors, some famous, some ordinary people who wanted to meet the great man. He was patient with them, often remarkably generous with his time, especially with children, whose questions he answered seriously, as if they were fellow physicists rather than confused kids struggling with homework. He watched the world with mixed feelings. The war was over, but the peace was cold, tense, threatened constantly by the nuclear arsenals that America and the Soviet Union were building. The House Un-American Activities Committee and Senator Joseph McCarthy were destroying lives and careers through accusations of communist sympathies, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and conformity that Einstein despised. He spoke out, calling it a witch hunt, comparing it to the early stages of Nazi oppression, words that made him enemies among American conservatives, but that he believed needed saying. Physically, watched physics itself evolve in directions that excited and troubled him. Quantum electrodynamics, developed by Richard Feynman, Julian Schwinger, and Shinichiro Tominaga, provided a spectacularly successful theory of electromagnetic interactions between particles. Nuclear physics was revealing the structure of atomic nuclei and the forces that held them together. Astronomy was discovering strange new objects, pulsars and quasars that challenged understanding. Everywhere, physicists were making progress, except in the direction Einstein cared most about: unification and foundations. And yet, he could not entirely regret the path he had chosen. The search for unity, for deeper truth, was what physics meant to him. If he had spent his final decades pursuing incremental progress in areas where success was easier, would that have been more worthwhile? He did not think so. He had climbed high enough to see the summit, even if he could not reach it. That vision, that sense of where physics needed to go, was perhaps his final gift to the field, even if the field would not appreciate it for many years. The quest for a unified theory continues today, through string theory, quantum gravity, and other approaches. Einstein's specific attempts failed, but his conviction that such a theory must exist remains a driving force in theoretical physics.
April 18th, 1955. The pain began in his abdomen, a dull ache that Einstein initially ignored, attributing it to his chronic digestive problems. He had suffered from stomach and intestinal issues for years, legacies of stress and poor eating habits from his younger days. But this pain was different, more persistent, and gradually it worsened. When he finally saw his doctor in early 1955, the diagnosis was grim. He had an abdominal aortic aneurysm,
a weakening and bulging of the large blood vessel carrying blood from his heart. The aneurysm was large and growing. It would eventually rupture, and when it did, he would bleed to death internally. Surgery was possible, though risky at his age, 76, and with his other health problems. The operation might extend his life by a few years, or it might kill him on the table. Einstein considered the options and made his choice. He declined surgery. "I want to go when I want," he told his doctors. "It is tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." His attitude toward death was pragmatic, almost scientific. He had lived a long life, accomplished what he set out to accomplish, witnessed the triumphs and tragedies of the 20th century. He was ready. There was work still undone, equations still unsolved, but there would always be work undone. The universe was infinite, and human life was finite. He accepted the asymmetry. On April 13th, the aneurysm ruptured. The pain was excruciating. He was rushed to Princeton Hospital, where doctors stabilized him temporarily, but he knew, and they knew, that this was the end. He could have emergency surgery, but he refused. He did not want to live as an invalid, and he did not want to die slowly over months or years. If his body was telling him it was time to go, he would listen. In his hospital room, he asked for his equations, the pages of calculations for the unified field theory that he had been working on. Even now, on his deathbed, he could not stop thinking, could not stop trying to solve the problem that had eluded him. He made a few more notations, working through the mathematics, searching for the pattern that would unlock the universe's final secret. The equations offered no revelation, no dramatic breakthrough, but the act of doing physics, of engaging with the fundamental questions, gave him peace. He received visitors. His stepdaughter Margot came, and his son Hans Albert, who had moved to America years earlier and now worked as an engineer at Berkeley. Their relationship had been strained for years, marked by Einstein's emotional distance and Hans Albert's resentment of his father's neglect. But now, at the end, there was reconciliation of a sort, a shared understanding that love existed even when expressed imperfectly. Hans Albert stayed with his father, holding his hand, offering comfort. On the night of April 17th, Einstein woke in pain. He spoke a few words in German to the nurse on duty, words could not understand and that were never recorded. Then, shortly after 1 a.m. on April 18, 1955, his aorta ruptured completely. He died quickly, spared prolonged suffering, his body failing as he had predicted and accepted. The nurse noted the time of death. The greatest mind of the 20th century had ceased its restless questioning. What followed was both predictable and disturbing. News of Einstein's death spread rapidly. Newspapers around the world printed obituaries celebrating his genius, recounting his discoveries, lamenting the loss. World leaders issued statements. Scientists expressed sorrow and praised his contributions. But there was also something darker. The hospital pathologist Thomas Stoltz Harvey performed the autopsy and, without permission from Einstein's family, removed Einstein's brain, claiming he wanted to preserve it for scientific study. Harvey kept the brain for decades, refusing to return it to Einstein's family, eventually slicing it into pieces and distributing samples to researchers. The story became a macabre footnote to Einstein's legacy, a reminder that even in death, genius is not left in peace, that the world's hunger for answers extends even to dissecting the physical organ where brilliance resided. Einstein's body was cremated, as he had wished. His ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location, ensuring that no grave would become a site of pilgrimage or spectacle. He wanted to be remembered for his ideas, not his remains, and in this, at least, he succeeded. There is no Einstein mausoleum, no monument marking where his body rests. Instead, his memorial is the universe itself, which we see through equations he wrote, through concepts he clarified, through the revolution in understanding he initiated. In the days after his death, scientists and philosophers reflected on what had been lost. He was the last of the great classical physicists, a bridge between the 19th and 20th centuries, between the deterministic clockwork universe of Newton and the probabilistic quantum reality of Heisenberg and Bohr. He had lived long enough to see his theories confirmed again and again, to watch as technology he helped make possible, from nuclear power to lasers to GPS satellites, transformed the world. But he had also lived long enough to see the darker applications, the atomic bombs, the arms race, the ways science could be weaponized. His final years were marked by this duality, pride in human achievement mixed with fear of human capacity for destruction. The tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Politicians praised him as a symbol of America's openness to immigrants and refugees, conveniently forgetting that many of their predecessors had wanted to exclude Jewish refugees in the 1930s. Scientists eulogized him as the greatest physicist since Newton, which was accurate, though it undersold his uniqueness. Newton had operated within a conceptual framework inherited from centuries of natural philosophy. Einstein had demolished that framework and built a new one. He had not just answered questions within physics, he had changed what physics was, what kinds of questions it could ask, what kinds of answers were possible. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came not from the famous or the powerful, but from ordinary people who had never met Einstein, but who felt they had lost something important. They wrote letters to newspapers describing what Einstein had meant to them, how his example had inspired them to think differently, to question authority, to imagine possibilities beyond the obvious. For many, Einstein represented the power of the individual mind to change the world, to stand against convention and prevailing wisdom, and to be proven right. He was the patent clerk who became the most famous scientist on Earth, the refugee who found sanctuary and gave back more than he received, the rebel who never stopped questioning. In 1999, Time magazine named Albert Einstein the person of the century, beating out political leaders, artists, and other scientists for the honor. The choice was fitting. The 20th century was defined by the forces Einstein had helped unleash, both intellectually and literally. Relativity and quantum mechanics formed the twin pillars of modern physics. Nuclear energy, for good and ill, shaped global politics and strategy. The technologies that emerged from Einstein's insights, semiconductors and lasers and satellite navigation, became the infrastructure of the information age. Even the century's great moral struggles against fascism, against racism, against nuclear annihilation, bore Einstein's fingerprints through his activism and his warnings. The eternal echo. 70 years have passed since Einstein's death, and his presence in physics, in technology, and in human imagination has only grown stronger. His face, with its shock of white hair and gentle, knowing eyes, remains instantly recognizable, an icon of genius so pervasive that it adorns posters, t-shirts, and coffee mugs. But more important than his image is his influence, the ways his ideas continue to shape both how we understand the universe and how we navigate through it. Consider the smartphone in your pocket, a device Einstein could never have imagined, but that depends on his physics at multiple levels. The GPS that guides you through unfamiliar streets requires both special and general relativity to function accurately. The satellites that make up the GPS constellation orbit at high speeds, experiencing time dilation from special relativity that makes their clocks run slower than clocks on Earth's surface. But they also orbit in a weaker gravitational field, experiencing time dilation from general relativity that makes their clocks run faster. Engineers must account for both effects, adding microseconds here, subtracting them there, keeping satellite clocks synchronized with ground clocks within billionths of a second. Without Einstein's equations, GPS would accumulate errors of several kilometers per day, rendering the system useless. Every time you ask your phone for directions, you are benefiting from general relativity's accurate description of how gravity bends space-time. The camera in that same phone relies on the photoelectric effect that Einstein explained in 1905. Digital cameras use sensors made of silicon or other semiconductors that convert light into electric signals. When a photon hits the sensor, it knocks an electron free, creating a tiny current that the camera's electronics measure and store. The process depends critically on quantum physics, on the fact that light comes in discrete energy packets, photons, whose energy depends on their color. Einstein's light quanta, once controversial, are now the foundation of imaging technology that billions of people use daily. And the phone's processor, the chip that performs billions of calculations per second, exists because of quantum mechanics, the theory Einstein helped create but never fully accepted. The transistors that make up the processor rely on the quantum behavior of electrons in semiconductors, on the wave-like properties that let electrons tunnel through barriers they classically could not cross. Quantum mechanics is not just theory, it is engineering, the basis for the entire electronics industry, for computers, smartphones, televisions, lasers, LEDs, and countless other technologies. Einstein's legacy extends far beyond consumer gadgets. In medicine, MRI machines use powerful magnets and radio waves to image the body's interior without surgery or radiation exposure. The theory behind MRI is nuclear magnetic resonance, a quantum phenomenon, where atomic nuclei absorb and emit electromagnetic radiation in specific patterns that reveal the structure of molecules and tissues. PET scans, which detect cancer and map brain activity, rely on positron emission, a phenomenon predicted by Paul Dirac's relativistic quantum mechanics, another theory building on Einstein's foundations. In astrophysics, Einstein's general relativity has transformed our understanding of the cosmos. Black holes, once considered mathematical curiosities, are now known to exist by the millions throughout the universe, with supermassive black holes lurking at the centers of galaxies, including our own Milky Way. In 2019, the Event Horizon Telescope collaboration produced the first direct image of a black hole's shadow, the ring of distorted light surrounding a region of space-time so curved that nothing, not even light, can escape. The image matched Einstein's predictions from 1915 with eerie precision, confirming general relativity's accuracy even in the most extreme gravitational environments. Conspicuous waves, which Einstein predicted in 1916 but doubted were real for much of his life, were finally detected by the LIGO Observatory in September 2015, exactly 100 years after Einstein first published the equations of general relativity. The waves were generated by two black holes, each about 30 times the mass of our Sun, spiraling together and merging in a cataclysmic collision that occurred 1.3 billion light-years away. As the black holes merged, they released more energy in gravitational waves than all the stars in the observable universe were emitting in light at that moment. The waves rippled through space-time at the speed of light, traveling for more than 1 billion years before reaching Earth, where LIGO's exquisitely sensitive detectors measured space-time distortions smaller than the width of a proton. It was one of the greatest experimental achievements in physics history, confirming Einstein's vision and opening a new window on the universe. Since that first detection, LIGO and other gravitational wave observatories have detected dozens more events, black holes merging, neutron stars colliding, each event revealing details about the most violent phenomena in the cosmos. Gravitational wave astronomy, impossible in Einstein's lifetime, is now a thriving field, exploring the universe through a medium that is transparent even when the universe is opaque to light. Einstein's equations guide every aspect of the analysis, from predicting what waveforms different events should produce to calculating how gravitational waves carry energy across cosmic distances. In cosmology, general relativity remains the foundation for understanding the universe's evolution. The Big Bang theory, which describes how the universe expanded from an incredibly hot, dense state nearly 14 billion years ago, is a solution to Einstein's field equations. Observations of distant galaxies confirm that the universe is still expanding and accelerating, driven by a mysterious dark energy that Einstein's cosmological constant, which he once called his greatest blunder, may explain. The cosmic microwave background radiation, the afterglow of the Big Bang, has been mapped with exquisite precision by satellites, and its patterns match the predictions of general relativity combined with quantum field theory. Every observation of the universe at large scales confirms Einstein's insight that space-time is dynamic, that the fabric of reality itself can expand, contract, and evolve. Even in areas where Einstein was wrong or incomplete, his influence persists. Quantum mechanics, which he never accepted in its probabilistic interpretation, has grown into quantum information science, quantum computing, and quantum cryptography. Researchers are building quantum computers that exploit the strange properties of superposition and entanglement, properties that Einstein's EPR thought experiment highlighted to perform calculations impossible for classical computers. Quantum cryptography uses entangled photons to create communication channels that are provably secure, immune to eavesdropping. These technologies would have fascinated Einstein, even as they vindicated the quantum weirdness he found so troubling. Incarcerated, the quest for a unified theory, Einstein's dream in his final years, continues. String theory proposes that the fundamental constituents of reality are not particles but tiny vibrating strings, and that the different particles we observe are different vibration modes of these strings. String theory requires extra dimensions beyond the three of space and one of time that we experience, dimensions curled up so small that we do not notice them. It promises to unify gravity with the other forces, to reconcile general relativity with quantum mechanics, though experimental verification remains elusive. Loop quantum gravity takes a different approach, quantizing space-time itself, suggesting that space and time are not continuous, but discrete at the smallest scales. These theories are speculative, incomplete, but they are direct descendants of Einstein's conviction that a deeper, more unified understanding must exist. What makes Einstein's legacy so powerful is not just that his theories work, though they do, with a precision that still astonishes. It is that his approach to physics, his method of thinking, remains the model for how fundamental science is done. Einstein taught physicists to trust thought experiments as much as laboratory experiments, to follow mathematical beauty as a guide to truth, to question even the most basic assumptions about reality, and to accept that nature may be stranger than human intuition suggests. He showed that profound advances can come from a single person thinking deeply, that you do not need expensive equipment or large teams to revolutionize science, that what matters most is the courage to imagine that everything you have been taught might be wrong. Einstein's theories, they work through the derivations of special relativity, calculating time dilation and length contraction. They study the Einstein field equations for general relativity, even if they never solve them except for the simplest cases. They learn about the photoelectric effect and see the beginning of quantum theory. And in learning Einstein's physics, they absorb his spirit, the sense that physics is not just about solving problems, but about understanding what reality is at its deepest level. The hero who questioned everything. Purified. What do we make of Albert Einstein now, 70 years after his death, a century after his greatest triumphs, from the vantage point of a world he helped create but could never have fully imagined? We see him in all his complexity, neither the saintly genius of popular mythology nor the cold, calculating intellect of caricature, but a man of profound contradictions, of soaring achievements and deep failures, a hero precisely because he was so thoroughly human. He was the rebel who became the establishment, the patent clerk who transformed physics, but who spent his final years isolated from mainstream research, pursuing a unification dream that others considered quixotic. He revolutionized our understanding of space, time, and gravity. But he could never accept that nature was fundamentally probabilistic, that God did, in some sense, play dice. He was right about so much, but wrong about quantum mechanics, and his stubbornness on this point kept him from contributing to the quantum revolution in its later stages. He was the pacifist who enabled the atomic bomb. He meant well, signing the letter to Roosevelt to prevent Nazi Germany from gaining nuclear weapons first. But the result was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Cities obliterated, hundreds of thousands killed. The world plunged into a nuclear arms race that threatened human extinction. He spent his final years working for peace and nuclear disarmament, trying to undo the damage, but the genie could not be returned to the bottle. The knowledge he had helped uncover, the equation E equals mc squared, remained, and with it, the capacity for apocalyptic destruction. His regret was real, profound, but regret could not alter what had been done. He was the loving father who could not connect with his sons. Hans Albert once said that the only project Einstein ever gave up on was him, a statement that carries devastating truth. Einstein loved his children in his way, but his way was distant, abstract, more concept than presence. He was better at understanding the universe than at understanding the people closest to him. Eduard's descent into schizophrenia broke Einstein's heart, but he did not know how to help. And eventually, he stopped trying. A failure he acknowledged, but could not remedy. He was the husband who presented his wife with a list of degrading demands, reducing their marriage to a contract for domestic services. The coldness he showed Mileva in their final years together is difficult to reconcile with the warm, grandfatherly image he cultivated in later life. He was capable of emotional cruelty, even as he fought passionately against social cruelty. He championed human dignity in the abstract, while sometimes failing to honor it in the particular, immediate relationships that demanded emotional presence he could not always provide. Constrained, and yet he was also the immigrant who used his fame to fight for civil rights when it was dangerous to do so. He stood with Black Americans against segregation and lynching, inviting Marian Anderson to his home when hotels turned her away, speaking at Lincoln University when most white academics ignored black institutions, calling racism a disease of white people when white America wanted to blame the victims. He stood with accused communists during the McCarthy witch hunts, knowing that the FBI was compiling a massive file on him, knowing that he risked his reputation and even his safety, but speaking out anyway, because silence felt like complicity. He was the scientist who never stopped questioning, who taught generations that authority must be tested, that received wisdom must be examined, that the universe reveals itself only to those brave enough to look without preconceptions. His science was an act of intellectual rebellion, a refusal to accept that the universe must conform to human expectations. That same rebellious spirit informed his politics, his moral philosophy, his entire approach to life. Question everything. Trust reason and evidence. Follow the argument where it leads, and never let fear or conformity silence your conscience. Clang. Albert Einstein was not perfect. He was brilliant but flawed, visionary but blind to some truths that later became obvious, heroic in some ways and disappointing in others. He was, in short, human, and perhaps that is the most important lesson his life teaches. Genius does not make you infallible. Success in one domain does not guarantee wisdom in others. The qualities that make someone extraordinary in physics, the single-minded focus, the ability to abstract away from human concerns and think in pure mathematical forms, can make them inadequate in personal relationships that require emotional intelligence and presence. But Einstein's humanity makes his achievements more, not less, remarkable. He did not have superpowers. He was not born with a brain structurally different from others, despite the macabre dissections that tried to find physical evidence of genius. He was a late talker who struggled with school's rigid demands. He failed exams. He could not find an academic job after graduation. He worked as a patent clerk, far from the centers of scientific prestige, with no laboratory, no research budget, no team of assistants. And from that position, thinking in his spare time, he revolutionized physics. Not once, but multiple times, with ideas that fundamentally changed how humanity understands reality. That is the true inspiration of Einstein's story. Not that he was some superhuman figure beyond emulation, but that he was human, struggling with the same doubts and limitations that all humans face, and yet he persisted in asking questions, in thinking deeply, in following his curiosity wherever it led. He shows us that the most important tool a scientist, or any thinker, possesses is not IQ or credentials or resources, but courage. The courage to question what everyone believes, to imagine that the universe might work differently than tradition suggests, to trust your own reason even when authority tells you you are wrong. The compass his father gave him at age 5 never stopped pointing him toward wonder. The invisible force that moved the needle was a mystery then, and though Einstein later understood magnetism and wrote equations describing electromagnetic fields, the sense of mystery never entirely faded. Every answer led to deeper questions. Every solution revealed new puzzles. That is what kept him working until the end, scribbling equations on his deathbed, never satisfied that he had reached the final truth, because he understood that in science there are no final truths, only deeper approximations, better models, clearer visions of the infinitely complex reality that surrounds us. We live in a world Einstein helped build. The technologies we use, the scientific theories we teach, the ways we think about space and time and energy, all bear his mark. But more than the specific insights, more than E equals mc squared or the curvature of space-time, Einstein's greatest legacy may be the example he set, the example of intellectual courage, of moral conviction, of relentless curiosity, of the belief that a single person, armed with nothing but reason and imagination, can change how humanity sees the universe. The cherries' blossoms are falling again in Princeton, as they do every spring, drifting across the lawn at 112 Mercer Street, where Einstein once lived and thought and played his violin. The house is still there, now a private residence, no longer marked by any sign indicating its historical significance. Einstein would have approved. He never wanted monuments or pilgrimages. He wanted his ideas to survive, to be tested, to be surpassed if better ideas came along. He wanted humans to keep questioning, keep searching, keep pushing toward deeper understanding. And we have. The quest he began continues in laboratories and observatories around the world, in telescopes scanning the cosmos for gravitational waves and dark matter, in particle accelerators probing the quantum realm, in the minds of young physicists working late into the night trying to solve problems Einstein could not crack. The universe he revealed remains mysterious, beautiful, and strange, and every generation discovers new wonders that Einstein never imagined. That is exactly what he hoped for. That physics would not end with him, but would go on. That the conversation would continue. That humanity's understanding would deepen without limit. The man is gone. The equations remain. And in those equations, in the technologies they enable, in the understanding they provide, in the questions they inspire, Einstein lives on, still teaching, still challenging us to look at the world with fresh eyes, still reminding us that the universe rewards those brave enough to ask why, to imagine how things might be different, to trust that hidden beneath the surface of ordinary experience lie extraordinary truths waiting to be discovered. That is his gift to us. That is why, 70 years after his death, Albert Einstein remains not just a historical figure, but a living presence, a guide and inspiration for everyone who has ever looked up at the stars and wondered what secrets they contain, for everyone who has ever questioned what they were told, and